Yeah, so kind of the topic we wanted to talk about was the effect that a fiat system has on a society as as people's time preferences shift to more nearsighted time preferences, and that's a trend that escalates as time goes on, and you see as you that fiat inflationary system runs away, you see an inverse correlation with people's time preferences, and then they become more short term oriented to the point where they're not able to make any plans or build in the future, right? Or at least their capacity to do that is like significantly diminished.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, and they kind of focus on, they give themselves over to nihilism, and they pursue these short term pleasures and short term pursuits, and ultimately tend to lose meaning in their life, right? They kind of lose those higher ordering principles that people with higher time preferences have. And it kind of, you see a culture of consumerism embraced over sustainable productivity. And that's due in part to the shortening of the time horizon. It also, again, limits the ability of society to cast its hopes and dreams into the future, and that leads to a state of hopelessness among the population. And the effect of hope, the state of hopelessness, increases uh, over time at an escalating pace. And
Yeah, I guess it's true. Yeah, it's true.
yeah, and that essentially that leads to a state of moral decay. And you get the tragedy of the commons, which leads to the destruction of the world's natural resources. As short-term exploitation is weighed favorably against long-term sustainability. And individual values erode as life loses meaning, and individuals outsource their morality to collective state run organizations. And in that scenario, the pursuit of pleasure replaces the desire to build. Time, energy, and intellectual capital are allocated to meaningless pursuits. Speculation and gambling is incentivized as the time preference of the society shrinks. Inequality grows as individuals in power amass more capital and restrict the private property rights of individuals. As corruption grows, hopelessness grows in the middle class until it reaches a fever pitch, and nihilism tends to dominate the culture to a point where caring about anything is considered abnormal. Corporate media provides a select few issues for the masses to be passionate about, and straying from that tightly wound narrative is strongly discouraged through the existing incentive structure. And the nihilism stems from the realization that one is playing a rigged game. So long as money remains in the control of the state, the energy and vitality of the human race will be siphoned from them. The equality of opportunity that is popular in mainstream politics today is only possible if money is removed from control of the state. That is the notion that a man is entitled to the fruits of his own labor. Fix the money, fix the world, they say. Or at least fix the
Okay.
money, drain the fuel from underneath the greatest theft in recorded history.
Yep.
The idea of government control of money is rooted in the centralized command and conquer locus of control that was really successful in winning World War II. It that centralized command structure was extremely effective in defeating the Nazis and winning the Allied cause. That led directly to the Bretton Woods Agreement, which gave us our current monetary system.
Yeah, it was the measure needed for the time being. But we've been into it for what, like 70 years. So I mean, time changes, right? So
Yeah, yeah, and so it's not amazing that the centralized command and control structure that led to success in World War II was naturally applied to the economies in the wake of World War II, right? And by extension, applied to the money supply as well.
yeah, if you look back at history, I think we can both agree that over the history of mankind, you've seen these periods where you have global superpowers rising and then declining. If you look back at the British Empire or the Dutchies, and they all imposed their own currencies as the global reserve currencies of the war when they were in charge of the war actually. So I think it's a thing which is cyclical, and I think you've seen that happen in the past, and sure as hell it's going to happen in the future, I guess. Yeah, so I totally agree with you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of the logic of why they may have applied the centralized control to the economy and the money supply. But the unfortunate part of it is that that doesn't work, right? Even a genius can't comprehend a complex system comprised of millions of decentralized actors, who are each expressing their unique individual wants and desires. No one person can fully understand that. And, generally in an attempt to understand complex systems, the average person will tend to take one idea that is true in isolation, extrapolate it to the entire system, and apply it as a solution in an area where it has no business being applied.
Yeah, that's a big issue, right? Yeah, I feel you there. Yeah. And getting back for a moment, since we started to talk about you know mm, nihilism, right? So I realize it's some sort of a philosophic content, right? So what you just described about the cycle of an economy or whatever type of system, could be economical or financial. Of course, as everything in nature, it borns and then it grows up and then it picks up and then it naturally declines. Now, these sort of a passage in between, the rising segment of the curve and then the peak and the downturn. I mean, if you want to look, take it back to some sort of a philosophical standpoint, could it be something which resembled the dichotomy in between capitalism and communism in a way? Because if you look back at what Marx was saying, is like Marx was saying that basically communism is the cure for the period when capitalism goes just crazy. It goes out of control, and that's where uh, communism has to step in to get things back to quote unquote normal. Can we make some sort of a parallel in between this stuff, or I'm out of track?
So, so I've never actually read Marx or any communist literature. I've heard that it sounds very good, and obviously, I would imagine because it's very convincing for a lot of people.
Just in
Um,
theory, I can tell you that.
yeah, I tend to study more of the outcomes of it, right? Which is what really matters. You know,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
it's like in politics, people, some policy will have a devastating consequence, and people will say, well, their intentions were good, and it's like, well, doesn't matter. I mean, the intentions, what matters is the outcome. You know,
Yeah.
um, but as far as like the what exactly do you mean by the negative, the late stage capitalism, negative outcomes of capitalism? What do you mean by that?
Well, basically, even if you look at how the situation is right now and how we get there, uh, I think to some extent a lot of people would say that it is unfair in the way that when you have capitalism, of course, at the start of it, it sounds all fair because everyone starts out with the same opportunities, and then it comes down to human smartness and human ingenuity to come up with different ideas, and then on the open market, the best idea will win and will grant the owner of the idea a natural advantage over the other people. But the objection that is moved against this mechanism is that at a point this system is going to create a lot of disparity in between different branches of society. Which again, we could argue that, I mean, is it fair
Do you mean
or
like
is it not fair?
income inequality and like monetary disparity? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, basically income inequality.
Yeah.
It's like you could look at different branches of society, and nowadays you can look at some of them and say, yeah, that guy is making uh, that type of living, and he can have that standards of living just because maybe his father or his grandfather before him had this brilliant idea back in, let's say 50 years ago, and now it's just living the fruit of it.
So this is
While,
actually, yeah, it's actually a really good point, because I think people equate income inequality with one system or the other, and you're definitely right. Like in capitalist systems, you definitely see income inequality. You also see it in communist systems as well. It's like people in power
yeah,
exploit the system, and then they,
exactly.
so you see it in both systems. And I think it's not, income inequality is more of like part of like the human condition. Like
Yeah,
it.
I think, yeah, exactly. You just stolen the words out of my mouth, because I was thinking about human nature. So basically, it's the same concept at a point. Yeah,
Yeah, and I mean, then things do happen in history where like you know uh, something crazy happens and it resets everything, right? Like World War II, right?
yeah,
Who
exactly.
really cares what the wealth inequality was before World War II, right? It shook things up so much that everyone basically started over. But
Yeah,
and then once they started over, then the wealth inequality process began anew, you know, and then it'll
yeah.
continue
You
until something
you
crazy like that
basically
happens.
yeah, you
Yeah.
basically have a reset and a transfer of wealth, I guess, from who won the war and who lost it. I guess. Yeah,
Yeah. So, but this is important topic because we were talking about like people boil complex systems down into certain things that are true in isolation and then apply it broadly in a way that makes it untrue. And it ties into the saying that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And in
yeah,
in this case, the hammer is the redistribution of wealth. Um, and it's important to note that a central authority can't create wealth; they can only redistribute it. Right? They can't actually create wealth, and that's very important. Um, and that's the exact vector by which a financial system that relies entirely on trust is continually exploited. Right? It's that mechanism, which is currently being encouraged, right, and people are demanding more of it, that is the exact like vector of corruption.
yeah.
Um,
At the end of the day, yeah, absolutely. You reach a point where basically it's like when you whenever you start a competition, right? There is a saying in sports, right? If you start out well, it's very likely that you're going to win the championship. It's kind of the same logic, if you want.
yeah, and I think once the violation of trust in that vector is like widely understood, right, like the public, you know, is aware of it, I think they'll naturally demand that the central bank, and as an American, I'm kind of thinking about the Federal Reserve when I talk about it. Once that becomes public knowledge, I think they'll demand that that no longer is a private institution, and they'll demand that it becomes a public institution. And that's then you have a scenario where politicians are directly making monetary policy decisions, and at that point, that things actually don't get better. They would probably escalate in that scenario, because politicians in particular have operate
Talking
on,
about corruption.
well, corruption, yeah, but then also going back to the time preference, they operate on very low
Oh,
time preferences compared to
absolutely.
central
Yeah.
bankers. So you just see an escalation of some of the negative things you're seeing now if that happened. Meanwhile, people would be saying it's a good thing. And then probably what you would see is, supply and demand forces being stripped from the markets, and resources are arbitrarily redistributed based on whatever political thing is popular at the time. And then you would see production declines and supply shortages, become increasingly more common. And then,
Yeah.
so it's the centralized redistribution that leads to the supply shortages and the production issues, right? Where
yeah,
they say the opposite. They say, "Hey, we got inflation because of the supply issues and production
I,
issues." And
yeah, I think so. I mean, if you think about that for a minute, you would understand. It's very clear. I mean, everyone could figure it out. If you have a system where you got a lot of participants, everyone competing for the same goal, which is profit at the end of the day, they would be incentivized to seek efficiency in order to reduce cost of production and increase margins of gains, right? But when you have a central institution, well, I mean, first of all, they don't have skin in the game, first and foremost, right? So even assuming that they know what they're talking about, they don't have skin in the game. So how can you let someone decide what the rules of the game are going to be when they don't have skin in the game? They're not risking anything. It's just like we are governed by a plethora of technocrats, and of course, maybe they got degrees, they got PhDs, whatever. But sure as hell, I'm ready to bet at least the majority of them, they have never really worked in practical terms. So they know a lot about the theory, but they don't know about the practical part of the equation. So again, it's like how can a system work out really well if you let someone decide what the rules of the game are going to be if they don't know what they're talking about, if they don't know the dynamics, if they don't know the issues, they don't have a real touch on the matter. They are actually regulating. It's just mind blowing thinking about it like that.
yeah, I think if we're talking about something so dark and depressing as this, we have to inject a little bit of hope and optimism, and that's why I'm so bullish on Bitcoin in the long term. Obviously, different things are happening short term, but
Oh yeah, sure.
in the long term, you know, I see that Bitcoin is like the obvious solution. And going back to one of the reasons why one of the brilliances of Bitcoin is the way that it has essentially hijacked human greed as a way to enforce ethics across like the society, right? Which is a really interesting thing because the greed is the element, the human greed is the element that bootstraps Bitcoin into adoption, right? But then once the adoption is in place, then there is a code of ethics, you know, enforced by the Bitcoin code that everybody is incentivized to adhere to because of their greed.
Yeah, basically, it's the same argument that a lot of people are bringing up, and I totally agree with that. That that in order to take down the Bitcoin network, you would need at least 51% attack. But even then, who would be incentivized to perform a 51% account in the network? Because they would destroy even the value that they're holding. So they are disincentivized to do that. That's one of the beauty of the network.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different rabbit holes you could go down with that, but yeah,
Oh
basically,
yeah, absolutely.
there's multiple reasons why if you tried to do a attack on the network that you wouldn't, and you would just end up using it to secure the network. That would be you know even if you set out with the opposite goal.
Oh yeah, yeah, I get that.
But
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that like the way that Bitcoin you know hijacks human greed is a way to enforce morality on society is the fiat system does the opposite, right? It hijacks greed in a way that is detrimental, right? And allows avenues of exploitation, right? So rather than enforce them to some ephemeral code, right, that is unchanging and immutable, they can constantly change it, and not necessarily need to make anyone aware of the changes that are happening. So
Well, usually they tend to keep people in the dark as far as possible because it's easier to to control a mass of people which is unaware of what's really going on. So that's a fair point. Yeah.
Yeah, so people tend